Soap operas can be pretty dark and spooky sometimes, but that's just on stage, right? Well, much like many people believe in cursed objects or haunted houses, artists can be quite a superstitious bunch and have their own stories about cursed operas. So grab a beverage, dim the lights, and let's get spooky. Verdi knew the people of Naples were a superstitious lot. So when his opera Alzira got a poor reception there in 1845, his friends in the city said the work must have been cursed. 4 years later, Verdi returned to Naples with a new opera, Louisa Miller. This time he was hoping that the musicians would concentrate on rehearsing without getting distracted by talk of curses or supernatural forces. But as it turned out, that was too much to ask. At his hotel, Verdi noticed a group of men standing guard at the door to his room. When he went to dinner, they followed him downstairs, staying as close behind him as they could. He recognized them. They were supporters of his music and had been among the few Neapolitans to show any enthusiasm for Alzira a few years before. But why the attention now? No matter where he went, he found the group hard on his heels, at the theatre, at restaurants, even in the park. The men refused to leave him alone. When he learnt the reason, it came as no surprise. They were protecting him, they said, from supernatural forces. The failure of Alzira, it had been decided, was due to the influence of a jealous musician named Vincenzo Capicellatro. He was said to have the evil eye and had cursed the opera simply by greeting the composer before the performance. Surveillance was necessary to ensure that Verdi and Capicellatro did not meet again, inflicting a similar curse on the new work. Verdi was a rational man, and he had little time for these superstitions. In fact, he and Capicellatro were old friends and got on well. At least they did when they had the chance to meet. But, like it or not, it was clear that he was going to be vigilantly guarded all night, right up until opening night. And the plan worked. Or so it seemed. The performance, it began well, the audience was far more responsive than it had been for Alzira. The first 2 acts, they went without a hitch, and each act was followed by a rapturous applause. Then, disaster struck. During the interval before the last act, Verdi was on stage organizing the singers when a man rushed on and flung his arms around the composer. In that instant, a large piece of set came crashing down onto the stage exactly where Verdi was standing. He noticed just in time and managed to jump out of its way. Verdi turned to the man who was still clinging to him. It was Capicellatro. So Verdi's friend had finally found an opportunity to greet the maestro, apparently bringing with him his famous bad luck. The performance never recovered. The singers, still shaken by the incident, could not concentrate, and the audience went home grumbling that the finale did not live up to the potential of the earlier acts. Verdi wasn't too worried. He put the problems down to first night nerves. But for his mortified Neapolitan friends, there was no doubt about it. The evil eye had struck again. So this first story, I had some trouble verifying because all of the sources, they were quite obscure and all in Italian. Now, the only English mention of this I could find was on classicfm.com, and what you just heard came verbatim from there. It does come across a little bit as like, oh, spilling the tea from like 180 years ago. Take it with a grain of salt. Vincenzo Capicellatro is not a name that has withstood the test of time. In fact, his Wikipedia page, it's only in Italian and it's only 6 sentences long, and one of those sentences mentions this story and that it seemed to confirm his ungrateful reputation as a jinx. I mean, what a thing to be remembered for. So next up is probably the most famous of the cursed operas, Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. The problems surrounding Tristan and Isolde began even before the opera's premiere. It can only be described as a cluster. Beautiful, 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 but a cluster. It may be worth saying as well that there is a curse in the actual narrative of the opera. So Isolde curses Tristan in the first act because he's keeping her captive. He's delivering her into what's basically a forced marriage to the king. So anyway, but the real life curse. Wagner's personal life was in complete shambles at this point. He had needed to leave his wife Minna in order to avoid political persecution, so he moved into a little house on his patron's estate. And here he was greatly, shall we say, inspired by his patron's wife, Matilda Wesendonck. So much so that he dropped all his work on the ring cycle to start on the romantic epic Tristan und Isolde. And he also set Matilda's poetry to music, which was out of character for him because he only ever set his own text to music. So Anyway, eventually, Mina was reunited with her husband at the Wesendonck residence, but kind of noticed all the dodgy stuff between him and Matilda, and she ended up intercepting like a spicy little note between the two. The two ended up separating. Otto Wesendonck took his wife Matilda to Italy. So with a 22-year marriage having just ended and his mistress also leaving, Wagner completed Tristan und Isolde alone over 5 years, during which time he was still considered to be a political fugitive. Professionally speaking, the opera was also in very bad shape, so it took a whole 6 years to organize the premiere. The score, it was finished in 1859, but he was struggling to find the appropriate funding, which, I mean, suppose that happens if you sleep with your patron's wives. There were failed attempts to stage the opera in Rio, in Strasbourg, Paris, Karlsruhe, Dresden, Weimar, and Prague. And the opera started garnering a reputation as being impossible. Eventually, the opera was bankrolled by Mad Ludwig of Bavaria, and after an extensive search to find musicians capable, or maybe crazy enough, to be able to perform this insanely long and hard work, rehearsals started in Vienna. Hans von Bülow took the helm as the conductor, and Wagner started sleeping with his wife. Dude. Anyway, the first Tristan, he ended up quitting because the part was too hard, so husband and wife team Ludwig and Malvina Schnorr von Karsfeld were cast in the two title roles. It's like, oh, cute. So up until this point, maybe these difficulties were just bad luck. Well, here's where things start to get a bit freaky. So there were 70 rehearsals. 70. 70. A mind-boggling amount of rehearsals, and all was set for opening night in Munich. By now, it's 1865, right? But unfortunately, the Isolde, Malvina, she became ill and the premiere was delayed for an entire month for her to be able to recover. And when it did finally receive its premiere in July, the audience hated it. It was just terribly received. But they continued on with the production, but only for 4 more performances because the Tristan, Ludwig Schnorr von Karsfeld, he died very suddenly and unexpectedly. So it was commonly thought back then that the stress of the role killed him, but we think now he probably had a stroke. Really sadly, he had only just turned 29 years old, and his wife Malvina, she retired from the stage following this tragedy, despite being at her peak vocally. It gets worse. So in 1911, the opera was being performed, again in Munich, when during the second act, the conductor, Felix Mottl, suffered a heart attack mid-performance and died. He was 54. And then, in 1968, the opera was being performed, again in Munich. The conductor, Josef Karlberth, suffered a heart attack mid-performance and died. He was 60. If you believe in the Tristan curse, it claimed 3 lives, all in Munich, and each man died in the month of July. Illness in general has plagued Tristan and Isolde, even up to modern times. So as I mentioned, the original Isolde, Malvina, she was sick for a whole month, delaying the premiere. Now it's not so uncommon for singers to fall ill and need to be replaced, but the frequency and the extent to which it happens in this opera, it borders on like comical. Some notable examples. In 1904, the tenor Ernst Krauss dropped out of the performance after the second act, and the soprano, who was actually already a replacement for a sick Isolde. What do you do without a Tristan? They had no choice but to skip an hour and a half of music all the way to Isolde's famous Liebestod at the end of the opera. And a similar disaster struck at the Metropolitan Opera in New York in 1959. The Tristan was ill, and not just one, but both of the understudies were also ill. So, what do you do without a Tristan? On this occasion, the solution was for each Tristan to sing an act each. So Isolde had 3 different lovers in the opera. Here's a photo from backstage. It just kills me, her face. So we have Birgit Nilsson as Isolde, Carl Liebel, Ramon Venet, and Albert da Costa as the Tristans. So more recently, in 2008 at the Met, Ben Hebner and Deborah Voigt were supposed to sing 6 performances of the opera together, but due to repeated illnesses, the pair only made it together to sing 1 of those 6 performances together. And during the run, one of the Tristan replacements, Gary Lehrman, suffered a head injury mid-performance as a piece of set came free and struck him. So it was like a wrecked stage, so you know it's like a hill, and the loose piece started like sliding down towards the orchestra pit, but fortunately it like hit into the prompter's box. It stopped before it could go down and cause any havoc in the orchestra pit below and hit more people. So whether you believe the Curse of Tristan is real or that these misfortunes surrounding the work are purely because of the practical challenges of staging such a huge and difficult work is up to you. But what's for sure though, I wouldn't get too attached to the idea of seeing like a specific singer in the roles if you ever buy tickets for it. And maybe don't go and see it at the Bavarian State Opera in Munich in the month of July.
Morir, tremenda cosa.
So I've left this next story for last for a reason. So it might not have had the widespread destruction as the supposed Tristan curse. This next story, it's really, really sad and disturbing. And I don't know, it just gives me the chills every time you hear it. La Forza del Destino, or The Force of Destiny, is another Verdi opera which premiered in 1862. Now, the strange misfortune surrounding this work prevented tenor Luciano Pavarotti from ever singing the tenor role of Avaro. He just flat out, nope. And even Franco Corelli, he had his own La Forza del Destino rituals, which apparently, I don't know how true this is, apparently would grab his own crotch for protection. You do you. Anthony Stefanello, a well-known Italian director in the second half of the 20th century, so he would provide sets and costumes for opera companies all across Italy for productions of La Forza del Destino, but he insisted he himself would never touch any of the sets or costumes himself. So looking through the libretto of the opera myself, the word curse comes up 13 times. So make do with that information as you will. And the opera itself is about a curse put on the soprano by her dying father. So what happened that makes this opera so cursed? Well, there's a lot of smaller stories about the Forza curse from all around the place. It's uncommon for theatres to experience these bizarre power outages when performing the work. And the world premiere itself, it was delayed about 9 months when the soprano contracted a serious illness. So you may be thinking it's a bit like the Tristan curse, right? Well, let me tell you the very tragic and confronting story of American opera singer Leonard Warren. Born in 1911, Warren was one of the greatest operatic baritones of all time. And on the evening of March 4, 1960, the lineup of Leonard Warren, Renata Tebaldi, and Richard Tucker at the Metropolitan Opera in New York for Verdi's La Forza del Destino was hotly anticipated to be a historic performance. And it was, but not in the way that anyone could have expected. I'll read now directly what was published in the review of the performance in 1960 in the publication Musical America, written by Raymond A. Erickson. In one of the most dramatic and tragic events to take place on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House, Leonard Warren was stricken with a cerebral hemorrhage and died during a performance of La Forza del Destino on March 4. In the middle of Act 2, the duet for Mr. Warren and Mr. Tucker, Solenne in Quest'ora, brought another crescendo of applause and bravos. Mr. Warren then was left on stage alone to sing the recitative that begins Morir, tremenda cosa, to die, tremendous moment. How ominous this phrase was to prove. Mr. Warren continued into the superb aria that follows, Urna Fatale, of Fatal Pages. And he had never seemed in better form as his remarkable voice rode the long legato phrases and soared excitingly through the cadenzas to the climactic high notes. At the end, he stood quietly until the shouts of approval had died away. Moving to stage left, he completed his next few lines of recitative and then fell forward heavily, as if he had tripped. Roald Righton, as the surgeon, entered singing his single phrase, Lieta novella e salvo, good news I bring you, I saved him. No response came from Mr. Warren, as Thomas Shippers, the conductor, waited with upstretched arms to bring the orchestra in. Uncertainty and wonder gripped everyone for a few seconds, and the audience stirred uneasily. Mr. Righton then went quickly over to Mr. Warren and knelt by his side. The audience did not know that Mr. Righton raised Mr. Warren's head slightly, and the stricken baritone uttered faintly the word, help, and then went limp. The audience was only aware of Mr. Righton's looking anxiously into the wings and at Mr. Shippers, and of a voice in the auditorium saying clearly, bring the curtain down. Warren was only 48 at the time. And it's heavy stuff, so whether you're superstitious or not, we can all agree that that's a pretty horrible story, and I'd imagine it would have been quite traumatic for everyone in the theatre to have witnessed someone, let alone a famous singer, drop dead in such a public way, especially after uttering words like that. Is that the end of the list? Now, what about the Scottish play? So in straight theatre, superstitions around Shakespeare's play, they're very famous, they're quite colourful, so much so that they're often parodied, and you're not even supposed to say the name of the work, like Voldemort. Verdi set Macbeth to music, and as superstitious as they are, sometimes singers don't have any issue with saying Macbeth. It's a tradition that just seems to have stayed with our Shakespearean actor friends. So there's many historical superstitions you'll find in opera theatres. So like actors, you wouldn't say good luck, but you also wouldn't say break a leg either. So if you enjoyed this video, which if you're here at the end, I guess maybe you did, hello. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like a video about stage superstitions in the opera house. Until then, in bocca al lupo, and I'll see you next time. Bye!